brand new, literally it's just a couple of hours ago in California. We have told you about this accuser before. She says she was raped by P. Diddy at a private home in the Bay Area in 2018. She says that she doesn't believe the police ever investigated her reports. Multiple agencies, not just one, 3. But now we are hearing so much more detail, and actually a level of detail almost unmatched in a lot of complaints that I've read through. I'm actually going to read a lot of the details in just a moment, and I'm going to do it verbatim, and so I need to give you a massive flashing red warning here. What I'm about to say is quite disturbing. There's a lot of uncomfortable language, and if you are triggered or upset by sex assaults and violent assaults, etc., then this is definitely not the show for you tonight. The accuser is named Ashley Parham, and she has agreed to allow her name to be made public. Let's be real clear about that. She is going public with her name. She says that in February of 2018, she met a man named Shane Pierce at a bar, and that Shane FaceTimed Diddy outside on the sidewalk, apparently trying to impress her. But Ashley Parham says that she told both Shane and Diddy on FaceTime that she wasn't impressed. And this is important. She says she believed that Diddy had something to do with the murder of Tupac Shakur, and said as much. Allegedly, Diddy warned her that she would pay for saying something like that.
Oh.
So let's just fast forward now to a month later, where she says this guy Shane invited her to come to his apartment. And the lawsuit says, quote, plaintiff and defendant Shane then began to watch a movie, and defendant Shane offered her a glass of water, which he retrieved and brought back to the plaintiff. A few minutes later, Ashley Parham says that P. Diddy showed up with an entourage, including his top aide, Christina Coram, an unnamed woman who is not a defendant in the suit, and 3 unnamed men, one of whom she says was Diddy's driver, and Parham says that that driver waited outside throughout the whole of what I'm about to tell you. Parham says that Diddy was antagonistic from the start, and that he put a knife to her face. And now this is where I start reading directly from the complaint. Defendant Shane then partially undressed plaintiff, and then defendant Diddy removed the remainder of plaintiff's clothing, removing the knife from her face, and then retrieved a bottle of liquid from a large fanny pack. Defendant Diddy then squirted a bottle of liquid on plaintiff, which placed her in fear that she was being squirted with a chemical substance like acid. Plaintiff soon realized the substance was an oil/lubricant. Plaintiff was squirted with this liquid substance all over the entirety of her naked body. Defendant KK was then told by defendant Diddy to insert what looked like a syringe from sterile packaging into plaintiff's vagina.
What?
Defendant KK did as told, and then told defendant Diddy that she was unable to use the IUD because it had prematurely been released from its packaging, and an IUD is a birth control device. Defendant Diddy, upset by this, took the so-called syringe from defendant KK and tried inserting it into plaintiff's vagina instead. What? Defendant KK and Diddy began to argue as defendant KK continued to advise defendant Diddy that since the IUD had been prematurely released from its packaging, there was no way they could insert it into plaintiff's vagina effectively. After some time, defendant Diddy heeded the advice of defendant KK and removed the syringe from plaintiff's vagina and handed it to defendant KK. Defendants KK and Jane Doe then exited defendant Shane's residence, leaving the plaintiff alone with defendants Diddy, Shane, and Doe's number 1 and 2. Defendant Diddy then picked up a television remote that was near to plaintiff and violently inserted it into plaintiff's vagina. Defendant Diddy, while violently raping plaintiff with a television remote, told plaintiff that her life was in his hands and that if he wanted, he could, quote, take her and she would never be seen again. Plaintiff began hysterically crying from the threats by Diddy, along with the pain of being violently, vaginally raped by defendant Diddy with the television remote, as well as the lingering pain from the ordeal with the IUD syringe insertion. Defendant Diddy then instructed defendant Shane to turn plaintiff on her stomach, seemingly tired of hearing plaintiff's blood-curdling cries. Defendant Shane then grabbed plaintiff by her abdomen and hips and turned plaintiff on her stomach. Defendant Diddy then instructed defendant Shane to put a pillow over her head because he didn't want to see her face or hear her cries, and instructed defendant Shane to anally rape plaintiff. Defendant Shane did as he was told by defendant Diddy and began to anally rape plaintiff. Defendant Diddy then violently raped plaintiff anally after defendant Shane. Defendant Doe number 2 then joined defendants Diddy and Shane, taking a turn anally raping plaintiff. Immediately after defendant number 2 raped plaintiff, he exited defendant Shane's residence. Defendant Diddy then instructed defendant Doe number 1 to also rape plaintiff. Instead of immediately raping plaintiff, defendant Doe number 1 doused plaintiff with more oil/lubricant and then jumped on top of plaintiff's naked and oiled body, treating it like a slip and slide and knocking the wind out of plaintiff due to his enormous size. Defendant Doe number 1 then caught himself from sliding over plaintiff's oiled body and off the bed, and then began raping plaintiff vaginally. While defendant number 1 was raping plaintiff, defendant Diddy sat in a chair near the bed and began masturbating while recording plaintiff's rape by defendant Doe number 1. Another party's phone fell on the bed near plaintiff. Plaintiff then attempted to grab the phone, but it slipped out of her hands and onto the floor due to the oil/lubricant that had been doused all over her person by defendants Diddy and Doe number 1. Defendant Diddy began laughing at plaintiff's attempt to grab the phone. Throughout this violent gangbang-style rape, defendant Diddy made constant belittling remarks to plaintiff, including that he, quote, owned her now. Plaintiff's body was becoming more and more limp over the course of the violent rape until eventually she had no control over her body, nor could she move her body. When defendant Doe number 1 finished raping plaintiff, defendant KK entered the room to examine the condition of plaintiff, who was barely able to move or control her bodily functions. Defendant KK examined plaintiff to see if she needed assistance and was about to give plaintiff an IV fluid. Plaintiff cannot be certain if she did or did not receive such intravenous intervention. Defendant KK then opened a different bag, different than the one that Diddy removed the oil from, where plaintiffs observed several medicine bottles, IV fluid bags, and other unidentifiable powder-like drugs. Defendant KK then removed a pill from one of the medicine bottles and gave it to defendant Diddy. Defendant Diddy then inserted the pill into plaintiff's mouth and down her throat, to where plaintiff had no choice but to ingest the unknown pill. Defendants Diddy, Shane, KK, and Doe number 1 then exited the residence to the backyard, where they smoked marijuana and cigarettes. Plaintiff remained in an almost lifeless state in defendant Shane's bedroom until she finally regained her bodily functions. Plaintiff then began looking for her clothes and her purse that contained her car keys and cell phone, but could not discover them in the room or anywhere in the apartment. Plaintiff was only able to find a t-shirt on the floor, which she put on to cover her naked body. Plaintiff also observed a black condom wrapper on the floor of the bedroom, which she assumed was used by one of the defendants, most likely defendant Diddy, during the rape. Plaintiff then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and headed to the backyard where defendants were smoking, as that was the only way to exit the premises onto the street.